Programming a piece of software to perfectly counter a human player is hard. It's why game design and game coding is an art form, because it requires countless small tweaks in order to create an enemy or friendly AI that is just perfect. In fact, it's such a hard craft that good and bad games alike can have flaws in their AI design. These range from small problems that create loopholes for savvy players to massive issues that leave you wondering why they weren't fixed. Because while you can ignore many mistakes in a game, watching your robot teammates continuously walk into a wall or watching an enemy end themselves is pretty much impossible to forget. Such is the double-edged sword of broken AI, because it makes you remember a part of the game forever, but for all the wrong reasons. That said, sometimes having a funny exploit can add a new layer of interest to an old or otherwise ignored game, so it's not all bad news. After all, seeing mistakes only makes you appreciate all the stuff done right even more, so in a bizarre way, it's actually important that they exist. With that in mind, I'm Will for WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games broken by their AI. 10. Aliens Colonial Marines. When the long-anticipated Aliens Colonial Marines was released in 2013, players found themselves surprised at the, experience it contained. Despite the fact that production had taken longer than expected, the titular aliens were about as unnerving as a kitten in a silly costume, and about as deadly as well. These spooky extraterrestrials would wander aimlessly around in circles and seemed to care very little if they saw you or not, instead pottering about like your nan at a particularly exciting bake sale. Turns out, this was down to an error so simple it's almost heartbreaking. There was a typo in the Xenomorph's coding. Fixing said typo in the game's script made the peaceful critters suddenly more aggressive and way more bloodthirsty. Now, this is hilarious, but when you think about the countless painstaking hours the production team must have gone through just to be sabotaged by a small typo, you can't help but empathize with their suffering. 9. Double Dragon. In its original glory days as an arcade machine, you could blow through an ungodly amount of change trying to finish Double Dragon. Much like many similar games, it was devilishly hard in order to make you die as much as possible, so as to get as much of your money as possible. That is, until people found a way to save their hard-earned cash, because while the enemy AI was well designed, it had one fatal flaw. Enemies would try and dodge your fiery fists by approaching when your back was turned, often backing off if you faced them directly. The trick to this is that a move you could do, the infamous elbow strike, would strike backwards, gain an awareness of the AI's movement patterns, and you could literally beat every henchman in the game. That said, you'll still have to take on the boss, Machine Gun Willie, who can't be beaten with this sweet little trick. 8. The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. I love this game. Much like any game in the Legend of Zelda franchise, Wind Waker is a shot of wholesome adventure, seemingly tailor-made to brighten your day. Weirdly, the AI not being entirely perfect actually only adds to that. Should an enemy see you, they'll attempt to catch you the only way they know how, by barreling in a straight path towards you, regardless of what might be in their way. This means that if you're spotted by, say, an enemy while another enemy is between the two of you, they'll kill the foe between the pair of you in order to try and get to you. This means, with a spot of careful and tactical stealth moves, you can get your enemies to murder each other in their attempts to catch you. Kind of like a version of Tom and Jerry where there are 8 versions of Tom, each more ineffective than the last. Still an amazing game. 7. Dead Rising. Chainsawing the undead and desperately hunting for zombricks are two things that will never get old. However, that isn't to say there aren't some things about the first Dead Rising that are irritating. This is best seen in the way some of the people you can recruit and rescue behave. Against all logic, some survivors will forget they have any fighting abilities whatsoever and stand stock still as the hordes of zombies come to feed. While this is especially frustrating if they have a gun, it's almost as bad if they're unarmed, because so often they'll forget they can even push a zombie away. As such, sometimes you'll watch in equal parts horror and awe as an armed-to-the-teeth character stands screaming while the undead chow down their fleshy parts. Sure, you can pretend that it's because they're traumatized or whatever, but we all know the dark truth. The AI just rolled over and gave up. 6. Left 4 Dead 2. Now, never let it be said that Left 4 Dead 2 is a bad game. Should you and your pals want to murder a bunch of zombies, there are few better places to get your fix than Valve's fantastic horror action game. However, if your friends don't want to play the game and you're left with AI companions, you're gonna have a bad time. The AI teammates are riddled with issues. They often don't react when you're being killed by zombies, they're slow to offer any kind of aid, and they'll run into fire and kill themselves. The list is inexhaustible. And it gets worse the more of them there there are. Because one AI can be carried by a group, but 3 is a nightmare waiting to happen. The cherry on top of all of this is that if you die and then an AI player dies, the other AI will hurry to save their robot comrade, because apparently they hate you as much as you hate them. 5. Fire Emblem. Without a shadow of a doubt, strategy games are some of the most difficult to program enemy AI for. Not only do you have to prepare for the player's every possible move, but you have to do so with God knows how many different scenarios, while making sure they all function perfectly. Now, while Fire Emblem has some small issues, the vast majority of these are easy to ignore. However, one issue, the fan named Mattis Syndrome, can provide some pretty game-breaking moments. Mattis Syndrome is the nickname given to the scenario in which characters do things they would never do in the storyline in the battle mode. This is most iconically shown in the aforementioned Mattis being able to attack and kill his sister in the battles, despite being the fact that this is entirely out of character. The Fire Emblem series is by far the most addictive strategy series you could get into, but if you do, you have to do so with the knowledge that the battles are almost entirely separate to the storyline in many regards, and that fratricide is more common than you might think. 4. Dragon's Dogma. As much as Dragon's Dogma is an absolutely Moorish game, it is also one where you have to deal with one brutal truth. Your teammates will die, and they will die because they are idiots. And it's not their fault either. The AI for most of these poor, unfortunate souls has them be borderline suicidal, running into dangerous attacks and standing still when they should be hauling ass out of danger's way. While they work well against regular enemies, any foe that works through a less conventional attack style, such as the cockatrice, which can petrify people, leave your pawn set up for a tragic death. In a way, this small issue with the AI actually benefits the overall game experience, as it leaves you either entirely protective of your team or all too willing to send them to their demise. 3. Prototype 2. In terms of open sandbox games, the Prototype series is a level of fun that's only narrowly beat by games like GTA. Prototype 2 is all the fun of the first entry in the series, letting you unleash practically endless carnage on anyone who gets in your way, or anyone who might get in your way, or basically just anyone really, because wreaking havoc is generally quite a lot of fun. And the fights are fun too, at least until you realize how much you can exploit them. For reasons that are likely to remain between the game's developers and God, every enemy in Prototype 2 has one glaring flaw. They just can't handle jump attacks. If you do a high jump without fail, the enemy AI will lose its mind and stand under you, staring at the magnificent height you have just leapt. Naturally, every single time, you can then slam down, crushing them and doing some not inconsiderable damage. You can even do this against the last boss in the game, which is essentially wild because said boss is designed with an attack that is supposed to be used against airborne enemies. But apparently, in this one circumstance, using that ability is a bit too much like hard work. And so, he'll happily let you leap on him again and again until he dies. 2. Pokemon Red and Blue. The original Pokemon games are still absolute classics to this day, and well worth replaying with as many weird teams of little critters as you can think of. But because so many people have been journeying back through Kanto, the loopholes in its AI have become increasingly obvious. For example, if an opponent's Pokemon has a move that is super effective against yours, it will always use that move. Sounds like a good idea. Well, no, since this also applies to non-damage dealing moves too. This is most hilariously shown by a series of YouTubers who have level 2 Weedles take down Elite 4 Lance's Dragonite. This works because Dragonite knows Agility, which is a psychic type move, something I've never understood when it should clearly be normal or maybe fighting, and Weedle is part poison, meaning that psychic moves are super effective. As such, Dragonite will hang out, repeatedly doing circuit training to up its agility, while Weedle slowly chips it down with poison. When it comes to Pokemon, don't fight hard, fight smart. 1. Ride to Hell, Retribution. I want to get real for a second here and remind you that in your darkest moments, when all hope is gone and you suffer immensely, keep one thing in mind. Thank God you aren't an AI-controlled character in Ride to Hell, because although the whole game is questionably designed and coded, the enemy AI is on a next level of stupid. Should enemies have to chase you, they'll do so in an orderly queue, coming across more like a series of adorable ducklings crossing a road than a group of hardened criminals. They also, for reasons that the mind can't possibly comprehend, appear to chase dynamite when you throw it, like a horde of suicidal Labradors. Although there are plenty more things that made people raise their eyebrows than just the dodgy enemy AI, it's certainly not something that can be ignored, because it's a huge part of the game itself.